Thank you so much, Ambassador Jeffrey, for giving us the time today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be on your program. It's very, very important to get the word out on issues such as the defeat of ISIS and our overall policy on Syria.
And it's a lot of questions are asked about this, those two subjects and others. I do want to start with the Russian offense on Idlib.
Yes.
There's many civilian casualties, as you can see. It's becoming, to many, a national security interest of the United States because it's only empowering Jabhat Fath al-Sham, which is very dangerous. What is your American position on this?
Well, the American position has been stated repeatedly by President Trump. He stated that this was restless escalation back in September of 2018 at the Osaka G20 summit. He made it very clear that he could not see, even under the justification of terrorism, a massive attack from the air on 3 million civilians. As you know, many of them are already internally displaced persons. So we take our guidance from the President. We are very strongly supporting the Secretary Generals of the UN's initiative for a board of inquiry, and we are pressing the Russians bilaterally and in every public and diplomatic forum to stop this slaughter.
What are the tools that the United States has currently to stop the Russians or to pressure the Russians?
Well, we're trying to do 4 things in Idlib. First, to ensure that chemical weapons are not used. You know our position. While we are a little bit ambiguous publicly, everybody knows that we have taken military action upon confirmed use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. So that's the first thing. We've been successful. Secondly, block a major offensive that would do exactly what you said. Spread terrorists who are located there all over Eurasia. Secondly, create a huge refugee wave of many millions of people. We've been successful there. Thirdly, we've tried to ensure that the Assad regime recognizes that it cannot achieve a military victory. It understands that, we believe, because they have gained very little territory between the actions of the Turks and the actions of the opposition and the outrage of the international community. The Assad regime has been limited. The fourth thing we have not been successful in, which is stopping civilian casualties by this egregious, indiscriminate, and criminal aerial bombardment.
What do you intend to do about that? Because this is basically is the big question, is how to stop these attacks, especially that Russia is not finding any pressure to deter its forces or to make a decision to stop this assault.
Well, I would disagree. First of all, if the regime thought it could get away with it, believe me, it would launch a major offensive and would probably be supported at least by the Russian military. It doesn't think it can get away with that. If it thought it could use chemical weapons against the Syrian people, as we've seen so many times in the past, it would do that. So to say that we're not successful there, I would challenge that. However, what we are doing, we're not going to go in militarily unless they were to use chemical weapons. But what we are doing is as much political pressure as possible. Look at that tanker full of a huge amount of oil seized by the British in Gibraltar. That was a tanker destined for Assad and his evil military forces. It was stopped because of sanctions on the regime. So we're going to up these sanctions. We're going to increase the diplomatic pressure. His country, Assad, didn't get brought back into the Arab League last March. Why? Because the Arab states reject the behavior that we see in Idlib and elsewhere. So I wouldn't say we're not doing anything, we're just not doing enough.
Eastern Syria, a very big question, very important American presence there. To many, it's stopping the comeback of ISIS and obviously stopping or deterring the Iranian forces from having the land bridge. How committed is the United States to the eastern province of Syria?
Okay, first of all, our mission there is the enduring defeat of ISIS. Our troops, by carrying that mission out in an effective way, of course, maintain stability and security in about 30% of Syria, and the region is denied to the, again, evil forces of Assad that we last saw killing civilians in Idlib a couple of minutes ago in our discussion. So, but that's not our actual mission. The mission is the defeat of ISIS. We think we're pretty successful. The President has announced that after the defeat of the Caliphate of ISIS as a physical force, as a territorial army, if you will, we will do a responsible and deliberate withdrawal of our forces there. But he also committed to leave a small ground presence for an indeterminate time, as well as continue to provide air cover over the region, which is very important, and be prepared to send our special operations and other forces back in if we see ISIS reconstituting. So we are very committed to northeast Syria.
What do you say and you comment about the reports of the return of ISIS to some part of the eastern part of Syria, the desert part of Syria, and to western Iraq?
Well, first of all, the eastern part of Syria, what you're referring to, is the Badia Desert, and unfortunately we're not responsible for that part of Syria. The regime it's doing a terrible job. Why? Because its evil military forces are committed to killing civilians in the northwest rather than taking care of a real threat, ISIS, in the Badia Desert. That's the first thing. Secondly, we do take actions occasionally of one or another sort that I won't get into against ISIS in that area. Thirdly, we are concerned about a resurgence of ISIS. The ISIS we're facing today in either Iraq or Syria is nothing like the ISIS state that we dealt with before, but it's still a threat. It still needs to be dealt with. That's why we have these military, these political, and these economic efforts in Syria and in Iraq, with a coalition of 81 nations and organizations supporting the Iraqi and Syrian people, and we're very proud of what we've accomplished.
What about the 10th base and the Rukban, which is a refugee camp that we hear many reports about, where the people are suffering on a daily basis? What is the American position on that humanitarian issue, and obviously the continuation of the presence in the 10th, which is another very important state or a place to hold American presence?
To all of your viewers, if you want to see what the domination of your region by Iran, supported by Russia, produces, take a look first at Idlib and secondly at Rukban. The UN has repeatedly set up humanitarian convoys there. Many of these people actually would like to leave if they could trust the regime of Assad, but they can't trust the Assad regime. And the Assad regime is blocking the delivery of humanitarian aid, or has been. We think we have another operation that can start in the near future. We're looking into how much that can help, either bring people out who are willing to resettle or provide humanitarian assistance, but this has been very difficult because of the regime.
How could you maintain the lasting defeat of ISIS if the United States is not committed to the security and stability and democratic transition of the areas under the control of the SDF forces? How committed is the United States to maintaining and controlling and helping in these efforts going forward?
Well, first of all, in the political process, we are a leader dealing directly with the Russians. I was with Secretary Pompeo when we met with both President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov, largely on the issue of the political process in Syria. The relevant UN resolution 2254 from 2015 calls for free and fair elections monitored by the United Nations everywhere in Syria and with the diaspora, the refugees who have left. That's the way to move forward to not only assure that we don't have a repeat of the Syrian internal conflict, but also the internal defeat of Daesh. Enduring defeat of Daesh. So that's what our focus is on the political side. On the military side, of course, we're working with the SDF, our partners in the Northeast, as well as our Iraqi partners, to keep the pressure on these resilient, violent terrorist cells that are popping up in various places.
Very important point that you mentioned, Ambassador, which is the elections in Syria. I know this is a futuristic talk. We're talking about sometime in the future that this would happen, but there's a lot of fears and speculations among people when there's talks about elections that Assad would somehow be allowed to run. And there is the notion that this is a war criminal that was never won in a fair and democratic election. And if he does get allowed to run, that means he is being recognized by the United States and the international community, and there's no trust in the elections anymir. What do you comment on that?
First of all, we believe that the Syrian government, under Assad's leadership, has committed many, many war crimes. And that has been documented by the Syrian people themselves and by various outside observers. Secondly, free and fair elections mean free and fair elections. Do I think Assad can win a free and fair election? Absolutely not. But is the United States going to tell the Syrian people who can run for office and who can't? No, we can't do that. That has a name, regime change, and we're not committed to regime change. We're committed to a dramatic change in the behavior of that regime, a dramatic change brought about by free and fair elections. That's what the UN calls for. That's what we support.
I think that's going to take another conversation, but I do want to ask you about Turkey. Where is the negotiations with Turkey going in terms of having that safe zone, which Turkey is asking for? What do we anticipate coming out of these negotiations, knowing the difficulties we've been having with the Turkish government?
Well, we have two partners who have been both very, very effective in fighting Daesh, particularly in Syria. But for historic reasons, both sides not only don't trust the other, but feel under security risk from the other side. And that includes the Turks, not just the SDF, which has a largely but not entirely Kurdish leadership. So what we've tried to do is to find a way to relieve the pressure on the two sides by withdrawal of certain SDF forces on the one hand, and a safe zone where Turkey would be able to observe what's going on and be able to have one or another sort of presence with us, the United States, in that zone to ensure that we can all focus on the job at hand, which is maintaining stability and security in the Northeast and defeating ISIS once and for all.
Do you think there is a way to basically address the concerns of both the Kurds, the Arabs, and the Turks? By the United States?
I don't put it into ethnic groups. I would say the state of Turkey, the SDF, which is a Kurdish Arab coalition, largely led by Kurds at this point, many of them with ties to the PKK, which is the problem. I would say, yes, there is a possibility, but we're still working on the details.
What is your position on the Iranian regime and the Iranian militia's presence in Syria? There are many reports that, you know, this is actually being asked for by the Assad regime for the Iranians to be there. I know that there's been comments by the administration that you want the withdrawal from the Iranian forces from Syria, but how do you want to go about that?
Well, first of all, we think that if you can come up with, through UN Resolution 2254, with its call for collective action against terrorism, also a general ceasefire in terms of the internal conflict and the other conflicts that have developed there, and a political process culminating in elections and a government that treats its own population better, we think that under those circumstances, the armies that have been committed to this fight should go home. And first among them is the Iranians, because unlike the other military forces that are there, the Iranians are trying to project power. They're doing the same thing, we think, in Iraq, the same thing in Lebanon, the same thing in Yemen. Once upon a time they said they were against the Israelis, but they were against much of the Syrian population who they've been slaughtering since 2014. Think of Aleppo. They're against much of the Iraqi population. They're against the Saudis and the Emiratis and others through the launch of missiles out of Yemen by the Houthis, and of course they're against Israel with the presence both in Israel, in Syria and in Lebanon. So yes, we think that problem number one in the region is Iran.
A lot of people were saying if the United States has this serious maximum pressure campaign on Iran, it could do very easily what Israel has been doing, which is targeted airstrikes against the Iranian militias in Syria. And why not go after Iran in Syria?
Well, the first position of the United States is to lead a regional and ultimately a global coalition for collective security, where we work to support our allies and partners, but they also have to play a role in their own security. That's only reasonable. I won't get into the details of what Israel is doing in Syria against Iranian targets, but so far I believe that whatever they're doing, it's been effective. We support whatever they're doing 100% against the Iranians in Syria. We're reviewing constantly the Iranian presence in Syria. We think the political negotiations we're doing is the best way to get them out permanently. But in the interim, Israel has existential security threats emanating from Iranian forces and weapon systems in Syria. Israel is going to act against them. We're going to support Israel.
I'm not sure if you heard about the new reports today about Hezbollah forces, actually militia, fighting against the people in Idlib on the ground.
We have heard reports from the people on the ground of increased Iranian involvement. I believe some of these reports are true.
I do want to ask you about Sochi and Astana because those are two, negotiation conferences that have been held by the Turks and the Russians and the Iranians with no results, with no tangible results. What is the American position on these conferences?
The position is we support the United Nations, the Secretary General, who's been strong like a rock on Syria, the Board of Inquiry against those who've committed crimes in Idlib, the support for the political process, but also Geir Pedersen, the UN envoy for Syria. They're doing, both of them, a very good job. You're right, the Astana process has not produced a nationwide ceasefire, and it has not produced a constitutional committee stood up in Geneva under UN auspices. That's what we're expecting it to do. The negotiations have been going on for over 18 months. I'll tell you who's responsible. First and foremost, the Assad regime. We've talked to everybody involved. There's no doubt the Assad regime is blocking. We're down to one single name out of the 150 in the Constitutional Committee. And we think that maybe that can get fixed, but then there'll be other problems. So the regime still hasn't taken a final decision. Can it win militarily in Syria, or must it accept a political compromise solution? We believe it's the latter, but we don't think the regime has arrived at that point yet.
Now we're approaching the anniversary of the chemical weapons attack that happened in Syria against civilians. Many people do rely on the fact that there are investigations of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Syria, and obviously the chemical weapons attack and attacks that were committed by the Assad regime. What do you think the real path to get to any type of results? And is there a political, basically a position by the administration that could be leading or pushing for more accountability on the Assad regime?
At every opportunity, this has a very, very high priority in the Trump administration and in Mike Pompeo's State Department. We are focusing on chemical weapons use by the Syrians because that opens the door to weapons of mass destruction by anybody. There are a whole set of UN organizations, the OPCW and others, and they've organized under various names investigatory panels who would go in and actually attribute blame, not just discover whether something has happened, but who is responsible for it. Who's blocking that? The Syrian government not issuing visas and taking other actions. Who protects them in the Security Council? Russia. That's the problem we have, but we're going to keep hammering on this because we have very deep suspicions that it's not over with the Syrians and chemical weapons.
Do you have a comment on the allegations of the United Nations being part of, corruption allegations, reports that they basically help the Assad regime in different ways? And we saw the sanctions against Tamer Fawz, which involved the Four Seasons Hotel, and having people being from the United Nations staying in these hotels, paying money directly to the Assad regime, millions of dollars a year. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, no, I have no comment on allegations of corruption. On the case of Tamer Fawz, he was under sanctions by the European Union. He has become recently under sanctions from the United States, and we're going to pursue every way, every route available to us to separate him from his ill-begotten wealth and to then go after other people like him.
Do you have a comment to the Syrian people and people who are watching us today about the chemical weapons attack anniversary as the Special Envoy to Syria?
Well, this administration has, other than in pure self-defense, been very reluctant to use military force. There's been one major exception: when chemical weapons are used against the Syrian people. I think the Syrian people should be encouraged by the position of the Trump administration on this.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Jeffery. It's great to have you.
Okay.